Welcome, everyone. I hope and I pray that everyone is doing well. We're continuing our in depth look at the Lord's Prayer, what many call the most influential prayer in history. Before we do that, though, I want to just start with a quick survey, something I saw on Facebook that asked who's got the best bread as far as all the different restaurants go. You have a choice of Texas Roadhouse, Red Lobster, Olive Garden, or Outback Steakhouse. I'm not sure if I've ever had the Outback Steakhouse one, but I definitely have a favorite among the others. And I just kind of wondered what your favorite one is. You probably have one in mind. Well, you'll see how that ties in with our sermon. But let's start off talking about, you might remember, you're probably familiar with the first wave of shortages that came after that pandemic arrived back in March, which seems like, a decade ago. It included things like hand sanitizer, Clorox wipes, which, are still hard to get, face masks, and of course, toilet paper. Now, you may not be familiar with the second wave of shortages that started shortly after that. That included things like rice, dried pasta, video game consoles, at-home pedicure equipment, and hair cutting razors. And one item in particular that relates to today's sermon, and that is flour. Flour. An article appeared in the Atlantic a few months ago. It was called "Americans Have Baked All the Flour Away." You see, right after the lockdown began, related to the pandemic, market-wide demand for flour actually shot up 160%. In fact, King Arthur flour, which I guess is one of the main brands for at-home bread bakers, actually saw a 2,000% rise in sales back in March. And so what happened was that just like the toilet paper supply chain, the flour supply chain couldn't handle the rise in demand. And so there were shortages of flour. Now, the ironic thing is that baking had actually been on the decline ever since the 70s and 80s, and that was due in large part to changes in the workforce. More and more people in the family were away at work; they were at home baking. But of course, during the pandemic, there's been this big demand for flour because more people are at home baking, more people than ever. And the article says it's because the lockdown was a convergence of two things. One is that people are spending more time at home, and two, they're also spending less time at restaurants. And those two things come together that created that resurgence in baking. The article states this: faced with the quick collapse of the country's robust convenience economy, which has adapted to feeding people millions of sandwich bread slices, burger buns, croissants, and pizza crusts every day, Americans have been forced to confront a fundamental bargain that the food system had made on their behalf. The broad availability of prepared and processed foods means that a lot of people have no idea what they're doing in the kitchen. And now millions of people are hurtling backwards into an existence where frequent bread making feels like an elemental part of American life. I remember when this first hit and everything shut down, and one of the things that we were craving, especially my daughter-in-law Joelle, pizza. So we went and we bought the tubes of the Pillsbury crust, and we tried making our own pizzas. I guess we weren't all that great because those tubes are still sitting in our refrigerator. But that explains this resurgence in baking as our convenience economy that we are so dependent on was collapsing, at least for a season. And so, even though most of us, still have access to what we need, I mean, let's not kid ourselves. We're still been able to get the things we need for the most part. This pandemic has disrupted, at least for a brief time, how our needs are being met. And it's broken what this article calls the illusion of self self-sufficiency. It's broken the illusion of self-sufficiency. And it's created conditions where many of us find ourselves back in our kitchens, baking bread or other things, if you can find the flour. And by the way, I'll be glad to loan you some flour if you promise to bake me something yummy. All right, so this somewhat minimal disruption to our illusion of self-sufficiency can actually help lead us to a deeper understanding of the next line that we're going to look at in the Lord's Prayer. That line, which is, give us today our daily bread. Give us today our daily bread. Now, this marks about the halfway point. We're about halfway through a series of sermons. We're explaining that most influential prayer in history, commonly known as the Lord's Prayer. It's a short prayer that Jesus taught his disciples. Maybe it's better called the disciples' prayer, because it's a simple how-to guide for all of us disciples, on how to pray. And it's kind of a basic framework that we can build a life of prayer on. And so we've been unpacking this prayer line by line. And so far we've looked at the first half of the prayer, starting with our Father in heaven, and it continues on, hallowed be your name, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That all focuses on the Father. Now in the second half, Jesus teaches us how to ask him to supply our basic needs. After we started off by wanting to glorify the Father, but now we can turn to our own needs. So, if you have your Bibles, open up to Matthew chapter 6. The prayer's in verses 9 through 13. We're going to be focusing on that line, give us today our daily bread. Many people are familiar with this line, or at least they've heard this line, but in order to grasp some of the deeper meaning, what we're going to do is we're going to divide this line of the prayer into four shifts. I have to be careful how I say that. 4 shifts. And I want to once again credit Austin Goen for this perspective. This prayer involves making 4 shifts in our thinking. For example, it's going to involve shifting our thinking about how we get our material needs met, especially during times like these when our normal strategies are being at least slightly disrupted. Even as we're able to slowly get back to normal, this disruption, it's a good opportunity to rethink this line of the Lord's Prayer. As we said, this line requires us to make 4 shifts in our thinking, and the first shift is related to the word give, which of course is the first word of this line of the Lord's Prayer. That word give shifts us from self-sufficiency to dependence. From self-sufficiency to dependence. We have to ask for something. At the very beginning of this first line is this word give. It's a word that reminds us that we're not quite as self-sufficient as we like to think. Let me repeat that. We're not quite as self-sufficient as we like to think. There's a popular YouTube channel called Self-Sufficient Me, and the host is this Australian guy who's been described as the Steve Irwin of backyard farming. He teaches you things like which vegetables grow fastest. I thought about telling Debbie about this, but he also talks about how to build a chicken coop, which what Debbie wants to do next year. I don't want to do that. It's the title of his YouTube channel should tell you people like to be self-sufficient. It's what we're all trying to be in the Western world. American society is full of individuals who don't want to have to depend on anyone other than themselves to meet their basic needs. But as the author from the Atlantic article mentioned, this pandemic has disrupted our illusions of self-sufficiency, and now we're realizing we're actually dependent. We're more dependent than we realize. We're dependent on systems beyond our control, like the flour supply chain or the toilet supply chain. We're not nearly as independent as we like to tell ourselves. And if we're honest, we have to admit we're really not very self-sufficient at all. And so the question that we need to ask ourselves is not how will we be independent? The question we should ask is who will we depend on? Who will we depend on? As we're finding that certain systems aren't nearly as dependable as we thought, it's an opportunity to rediscover what it means to be dependent on God instead, and what it means to ask Him for help. And it's all in the first word of that prayer, of this line of the prayer, give. Give. Here's a good line that I'm going to steal. If God were ever able to fill out, or ever had to fill out his tax forms, He would be listing us as His dependents, right? There's a song from the British folk rock band Mumford & Sons that kind of communicates this in their lyrics. It's called The Cave, and there's a lyric that they sing. It goes like this. So come out of your cave, walking on your hands, and see the world hanging upside down, so you can understand dependence when you know the Maker's hand. And what they're talking about here is a moment of awakening, when you realize that the whole world is dependent on God. And they're actually paraphrasing a line from G.K. Chesterson's biography of St. Francis, because St. Francis had a moment like this awakening moment in his life. And we're actually going to talk some more about St. Francis in a few weeks when we start a series called How to Become a Saint. Anyway, this first word, give, is all about having to ask God for something. It's shifting from self-sufficiency to dependence. It means shifting from relying only on ourselves, trying to get by relying only on ourselves to meet our needs, to realizing that God is the one who will meet our needs. All right, the second shift is with the word us. Give us, not give me. That's not how Jesus teaches it. He says, pray, give us. And this word shifts from individuals to whole societies, from an individualistic way of thinking to a community-wide way of thinking, to thinking about people beyond ourselves. If you remember, we talked about this when we did kind of a deep dive on the first word of the Lord's Prayer. Remember how Jesus teaches us to pray to our Father, not just my Father, our Father. It's not just my Father, it's not just forgive my sins, and it's not just asking God to meet my needs. It's our Father, forgive our sins, and give us our daily bread. We're not just praying about our own needs, we're also asking about the needs of the whole community around us. We're not just praying for our church family, but for our neighbors as well, and those around us in need. Let me share some commentary. This prayer disrupts the kind of individualistic spirituality that's just you and God that has so permeated American life. And it brings us back to a way of seeing our relationship with God as something that has implications in the lives of those around us. It's never just about me and God. It's about us and God as well. Martin Luther, he was the 16th century Protestant reformer who started a movement of Reformation that really ultimately our church comes from. And he wrote about this prayer in his catechism. A catechism is basically just a way of teaching people the basics of the faith. If you grew up in the Lutheran church like me, you took catechism classes. Well, he says about this line that it goes way beyond you and your needs. He says that when we're praying this line, we're actually asking God to preserve the whole system that gets bread from the fields to our tables. We're asking God to make the whole system better and more just. Here's what he wrote. He said, this line, give us our daily bread, is a brief and simple word, but it has a very wide scope. For when you pray for daily bread, you pray for everything that is necessary in order to have it and to enjoy daily bread. And on the other hand, you are praying against everything which interferes with it. Therefore, you must open wide and extend your thoughts, not only to the oven or to the flour bin, but to the distant field and the entire land which bears and brings to us daily bread and every sort of daily sustenance. For if God did not cause it to grow and bless it and preserve it in the field, we can never take bread from the oven or have any set upon the table. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever, I do this every once in a while. We'll be having something, even a simple can of tuna or even a bag of potatoes. And have you ever thought about, like a pineapple, what it took to get that to your house? It's pretty marvelous when you think about it. Luther goes on to say, this prayer is especially against those who are responsible for perpetuating unjust systems that prevent daily bread from getting to the poor. So, when we're saying give us, we're not just talking about you and your needs and what happens when you go to the grocery store. We're talking about the whole system, from the field and the workers there and everything that all that it takes to get it to your table, the people at the grocery store, all those people. It's the whole community around you that needs to be fed. This prayer is not just saying, give me my daily bread, but give us. Give us. And when you do this, you're also asking, where in my community do people not have access to daily bread? I mentioned before that over at West Hills, we used to do a massive collection of canned food for the local food pantry. We called it the Mile of Cans because you line up the cans of food, it would stretch for a mile. We got to the point where we're stretching for 2 miles. And before we'd start that day, we'd always have a prayer, and we'd always make reference to this part of the prayer. And it's why we need to respond to needs. And things like the recent crisis at Light of Life. We need to respond to those things, maybe in a bigger way than we're currently doing. Now, of course, this goes beyond literal bread. This might be in the form of food or housing or healthcare, anything that people need to flourish. We need to be praying for that. And then you can begin to ask the question, well, what's preventing this access? Why aren't people getting access to their needs? And so that question might lead you back to the line, your kingdom come, where we pray that God's kingdom will spread here on earth and that he fixes anything that's broken, anything that is perpetuating any broken systems that are keeping people from getting access to their daily bread. Now, man, that sounds like a pretty overwhelming task, doesn't it? But let me put in a plug here. For one, it's a small, but it's a very powerful way that you can make a difference. I've mentioned this before. There's a fantastic local organization in town called 412 Food Rescue. And what they do is they rescue perfectly good food that's going to get thrown out from grocery stores or restaurants or caterers, stuff that usually ends up in a landfill. A really disturbing stat on their website, we waste up to 40% of our food globally. And that translates to over 1.3 billion tons annually that gets wasted. We try not to let that happen in our house, but I know every trash day we got to go in the refrigerator and take out something that's gotten yucky. Well, this shouldn't happen while 1 in 8 people go hungry every day. So here's what they do. They rescue the food. It's good food still. And these volunteers who they call food rescue heroes, help pick up the food and they deliver it to daycare centers and community centers and churches and food banks. And it's something you can get involved with. What you do is you can volunteer by downloading their app. They have this neat app which shows you where food needs to be picked up and where it needs to be delivered. And you can do that, just every once in a while, or you can set up a regular time to do it, whatever fits your schedule. But you can be a food rescue hero and be part of the solution. For more information about that, you can visit 412foodrescue.org. 412foodrescue.org. All right, the line shifts us from self-sufficiency to dependence. The line give us shifts us from individualistic spirituality to thinking of others around ourselves. Now let's go to the word daily. Give us today our daily bread. And this shifts us from infrequent praying to everyday kinds of praying. It teaches us that the prayer isn't just something that you do, every once in a while or when things are kind of desperate. We need to do it every single day, daily. We have to go to God with our needs. Even those times when we don't feel like, we don't need them today, even when we have plenty of toilet paper or flour stocked up. You see, this isn't the kind of prayer that you say once a year or once a week on Sundays. It's meant to be an everyday kind of prayer. Now, what's interesting is there's actually a lot of debate around the word that we translate as daily, and it's because the underlying word, let me see if I can pronounce it, it's epiousios. It's a very unique word. It only appears here in the Lord's Prayer. In all of Greek literature, you don't find it anywhere else, which makes it seem like Jesus was just kind of making up a new word on the spot to talk about what's going on. And so we don't know the exact meaning. We don't know if it's signifying an amount, whether it's, asking just enough to barely get by or scrape by, or, is it enough to flourish, or we don't know if it's signifying an certain amount of time, really. Is it just enough for today? After all, Jesus said, don't worry about tomorrow. It's actually kind of hard to know exactly what this is saying, but I think, the reason that most translation will use the word daily, and it's a good choice because it recalls a scene from Israel's experience in the wilderness. You remember that point in their history. They had been in slavery in Egypt. They were eventually rescued out of Egypt, out of slavery, and they began to wander through the wilderness toward what was known as the Promised Land. And while they're wandering through the wilderness, they're in this wasteland where food and water are scarce. And essentially what's happening is that their normal supply chains have been disrupted. They knew where to get bread back in Egypt, but now they're in the wilderness and everything's been disrupted and they don't know where their daily bread is coming from. And what do? Well, they do what we've been doing for months now. They start whining and complaining and blaming their leaders. Yeah, you hear them complain, we wish we could go back to the way it was before. At least we had bread and we knew where it was coming from. Yeah, sure, we were slaves in that, but here's what happened next. And this is what I think communicates this idea behind the phrase, give us our daily bread. They were complaining to Moses, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and had all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into the desert to starve this entire assembly to death. And then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. And in this way, I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. Now, on the sixth day, they would go to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. Basically, what's happening here is God is saying, look, I'm going to provide you bread from heaven, which they give the name manna, which is just a word that translates into what is it? What is it? Because they didn't really know what they were getting. And it was something they had to do every single day. God didn't give them bread for a week and they were good, or for a month, or for the year. He gave them bread just for every single day. And now, except for that sixth day, when they gathered enough for the Sabbath day, they'd have enough to carry over into the Sabbath day, so they didn't have to work on the Sabbath day. It's kind of like Chick-fil-A. You know, if you want Chick-fil-A on Sunday, forget it. And you see, it was something that they had to do every day. Every day. They had to depend on God very literally for their daily bread. And I find it interesting that God designed this line of the prayer to work in the same way. That every day we wake up, we have to come back and say, God, today, if I get daily bread, it's because you are the one giving it to me. It's not something we're meant to pray just every once in a while. It's something we're meant to pray every day as a way of developing dependence on God rather than on ourselves. And you see, if you get into the habit of asking God for this every single day, you'll begin to become the kind of person who routinely and habitually depends on God rather than on yourself. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to go home and throw away all the food in your pantry and start fresh every day. But I think what it does mean is that we can't place our future security on what we have stored up, but rather on God, who's going to provide for us afresh every day. You might remember that parable that Jesus told about the man who built the bigger and bigger barns to keep all his stuff in, but then he died and left it all behind. Yeah. So that's the third shift, from infrequent or rarely praying to praying every day. It's a shift we need to make in our thinking. The fourth thing we need to switch is wrapped up in this word bread. Bread. Give us today our daily bread. That word bread shifts us from thinking in terms of wants to thinking in terms of needs. It shifts us from thinking in wants to thinking in needs. Here's what Pete Greig says in his book, How to Pray. He says there's a strong sense in this phrase of asking for today's needs rather than tomorrow's wants. The language here that Jesus is choosing actually shows that Jesus is very familiar with the ancient book of Proverbs. You can hear it all throughout his teaching that Jesus is intimately familiar with the Hebrew scriptures. And you can even see in this model prayer that he's familiar with the ancient book of Proverbs. There's a Proverb 30, verses 7 through 9, that says this: "Two things I ask of you, Lord. Do not refuse me before I die. Keep falsehood and lies far from me, and give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only my daily bread. Otherwise, I may have too much and disown you and say, who's the Lord? Or I may become poor and steal, and so dishonor the name of my God." Now, so according to this proverb, which was very likely on Jesus' mind as he's teaching him this prayer, according to this proverb, to ask for daily bread means to ask for, on the one hand, more than poverty. And it's interesting, throughout Christian history, there are those who have thought that the most holy life is the one where you're living right on the edge of poverty, right on that poverty line, where you're barely making it. But this proverb corrects that way of thinking about daily bread. Now, on the other hand, It's less than riches. And this corrects that health and wealth gospel we talked about a few weeks ago, where you sometimes hear that from TV evangelists. Many of them teach that the truly blessed life is the one where you have everything you could possibly want. The name it and claim it idea. And this phrase, give us our daily bread, corrects that way of thinking as well. We're asking God for what we need, and He decides what we need in order to flourish. I've quoted the Bible historian Kenneth Bailey before. He studied Middle Eastern culture. He provided some helpful commentary on the Gospels. Remember we talked about him when we were talking about the prodigal son. He's got this great quote. He says, in this line, we're asking for bread, not cake. We're asking for bread, not cake. It's been said that praying this line of the Lord's Prayer is more like making a grocery list and less like a Christmas list. We're getting close to that time of year. The catalogs are starting to show up. Do you remember when we were kids, we had the Sears wish book. And my brothers and I would go through and we'd circle and put our initials by the stuff we wanted in there. Nowadays, Amazon sends you a catalog. Jamie Joel got theirs the other day, so David and I sat through and looked at it. When you're doing that, you don't put things on your list that you need, like oh boy, new sheets or new underwear, new socks. No, you listed the things you wanted. Well, this prayer is more about needs than wants. It's about asking for bread, not cake or Twinkies or whatever. Give us this day our daily bread. You know, there's a lot more good stuff baked into this passage. You see what I did there? And we'll have to look at it a little bit more next time. But let's recap what we've learned today. Praying, give us our daily bread, should cause us to experience 4 shifts. As you pray this line, as you pray it thoughtfully, let it shift your thinking and your habits. Let it shift your mindset as you, in the way you approach how your material needs are being met. We said this prayer shifts us from independence and self-sufficiency, or the illusion of self-sufficiency, to dependence. It reminds us that we must depend on God, the giver of all good gifts. It shifts us from individualistic spirituality to thinking about community needs. It causes us to... Did I forget to flip that one? I did. It causes us to shift from individualistic spirituality to thinking about community needs. It causes you to think of what others need and how to pray for them. And we're going to talk quite a bit about this some more next time, how God makes us part of His supply chain. I hope I shifted this one. I did. It switches us from infrequent prayer to everyday kinds of prayers. As Paul wrote in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, rejoice always, pray without ceasing. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. And it shifts us from thinking only about our wants to thinking about our needs. When you go through these shifts in thinking, you're ready to ask God for what you truly need. You're ready to pray, give us this day our daily bread. Well, now that we've had church in here, go be the church out there.